Manila envelope hit my desk at 4047 on a Tuesday afternoon, and the sound it made, that flat, definitive slap, told me everything before I even opened it. My boss didn't look at me when he dropped it. 17 years. That's how long I'd been with Hartwell Medical Systems. 17 years of 60-hour weeks, of missed Little League games and anniversary dinners gone cold, of building their proprietary surgical guidance platform from a whiteboard sketch into the technology that now ran in 43 hospitals across the country. And the man who delivered my termination notice couldn't even make eye contact. "Effective end of business today," he said, adjusting his tie. "HR will walk you through the transition package." I picked up the envelope. I looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Then I looked at him. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate the years." He blinked. I think he expected me to argue, maybe cry, maybe flip the desk. I'd seen other people get walked out. The shouting, the security escort, the cardboard box carried like a casket. I wasn't going to give anyone that. I put the envelope in my briefcase, stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the building for the last time. I don't think he ever understood what he'd just done. Let me back up, because this story doesn't make sense without the context. My name isn't important, but what I built is. 12 years ago, when Hartwell was still a mid-sized medical device company struggling to compete against the giants, I developed the surgical navigation algorithm that would eventually become their flagship product. We called it PathSync. The idea was simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. A real-time imaging system that could guide minimally invasive procedures with a margin of error smaller than a human hair. Surgeons who used it reported complication rates dropping by 31%. Hospitals that adopted it saw patient recovery times cut nearly in half. I worked on it nights, weekends, on vacation. I remember sitting in a rental car outside a Marriott in Cleveland, laptop open, my wife texting me asking when I was coming back to the room, and me typing back, "Just give me 20 more minutes," knowing full well it would be 2 hours. She knew. She always knew. She never complained once. What I also did 12 years ago, because a colleague pulled me aside at a conference and told me something I've never forgotten. Always know what you own, was consult an intellectual property attorney before signing my employment contract. I was 36 years old, and that attorney, a sharp woman named Marcia, spent 2 hours going through every clause. She found something, a carve-out. Research and development work initiated on personal time prior to formal project authorization could remain with the inventor under certain documented conditions. I kept records of everything. Every late-night notebook entry, every personal laptop session, every dated email to myself. For 12 years, those records sat in a fireproof safe in my home office next to my daughter's college savings bonds and my grandfather's discharge papers from Korea. I never thought I'd need them. Then Derek Sloan arrived. He came in as Chief Innovation Officer 18 months before they fired me. 41 years old, Stanford MBA, never spent a day in a laboratory or an operating room. He had the vocabulary: disruption, ecosystem, scalable infrastructure, next-generation pivot, and he deployed it constantly, in every meeting, in every presentation, in every company-wide email that went out under his signature. The board loved him. He had the kind of energy that reads as vision from a distance. Up close, he was hollow. I knew it the first time he asked me to explain PathSync in a meeting and then spent the next 15 minutes confidently misrepresenting how it worked to the people in the room. I corrected him, gently, twice. The second time, something shifted in his expression. It was brief, just a flicker, but I recognized it. I'd made an enemy. Over the next year, Derek systematically restructured the technical division. He brought in consultants. He reorganized reporting lines. He created new titles that sounded important, but moved the people who actually built things further from decision-making. He was laying groundwork, and I was one of the things in his way. My team saw it before I did, honestly. My lead engineer, a quiet, methodical man who'd been with me for 9 years, stopped me in the hallway one morning in February and said, "You know he's building a case, right?" I told him I wasn't going to play that game. He nodded slowly and said, "I know. That's what worries me." The termination itself was framed as a strategic realignment. They gave me 3 months of severance, COBRA paperwork, and a non-disparagement clause. The HR coordinator, a young woman who kept apologizing with her eyes even as her mouth recited the company script, slid a stack of documents across the table for my signature. I signed the non-disparagement agreement. I did not sign the intellectual property reassignment form. She didn't notice. It was page 11 of 14. People don't notice page 11 when they're sitting in a room that feels like a funeral. I drove home. My wife was waiting. She'd known something was coming. I'd warned her weeks earlier. When the meeting started, when my access started getting quietly restricted, when Derek stopped including me on emails I'd previously been looped on, she had a glass of bourbon poured for me on the kitchen counter. Not scotch. Bourbon, that's just who we are. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she stepped back and looked at me with those eyes that have known me for 29 years and said, "You built something real. That doesn't go away." I sat with that for a while. 3 days later, I called Marcia. She remembered me. Of course she did. I'd sent her a bottle of wine every Christmas for 12 years, which she claimed was a violation of bar ethics, and which she accepted every year anyway. I explained the situation. She went quiet in the way that lawyers go quiet, when they're thinking faster than they're talking. "The safe," she said finally. "You still have everything in the safe." "Every page," I said. "Every date-stamped file. Every personal laptop log." Another pause. "Give me a week." What Marcia confirmed, after reviewing my documentation alongside the original contract and the IP assignment form I had declined to sign, was something that made my hands shake a little when she read it to me over the phone. The foundational algorithm underlying PathSync, the core mathematical framework for the real-time imaging calibration, had been developed by me, on my own time, on my personal equipment, prior to formal project authorization. Under the language of my original contract, augmented by the carve-out clause she'd negotiated 12 years earlier, that foundation remained mine. PathSync ran on my algorithm, the version now deployed in 43 hospitals, generating roughly $340 million in annual licensing revenue for Hartwell Medical Systems, ran on intellectual property I legally owned. Marcia filed the documentation with the USPTO to formalize my ownership claim. Hartwell's legal team had approximately 6 business days to figure out what they'd done. I heard about it from my old lead engineer, who sent me a text that said only, "Legal just showed up on our floor." Like, all of them. I could picture it. I knew that floor. I'd walked it for 17 years. I knew where the coffee machine that nobody cleaned was, and the window seat where people would go when they needed to think, and the wall where we taped up the original PathSync architecture diagram back in the early days when we still fit in a room together. I didn't respond to his text right away. I was in a meeting with the Chief Technology Officer of Medaxis. Medaxis was Hartwell's primary competitor, a company that had spent the better part of a decade trying to develop their own surgical navigation system and had never quite cracked the imaging calibration problem. They were larger than Hartwell, better capitalized, publicly traded on the NYSE, and they had, through a discreet intermediary, reached out to Marcia's office approximately 2 days after my ownership documentation was filed. I want to be clear about something, because I've seen the way this story gets told and retold, and I've heard how it sounds to some people. I did not set out to destroy Hartwell. I want to say that plainly. 17 years of my life went into that company. People I care about still worked there. I didn't pick up the phone looking for revenge. What I did was respond when an opportunity presented itself with information I had always rightfully possessed in a way that was completely legal, thoroughly documented. And honestly, if I'm being truthful, somewhat inevitable, the moment Derek Sloan decided that the person who built the company's most valuable asset was an obstacle to be removed. The meeting with Medaxis lasted 4 hours. Their CTO was a thoughtful woman named Dr. Ingram, who had actually worked in interventional cardiology for 8 years before moving into the industry side. She understood PathSync. She understood what the algorithm was. She asked me detailed, specific, technical questions that Derek Sloan could not have answered in 3 lifetimes. We spoke the same language. By the end of the second meeting, their acquisition team was involved. By the end of the third meeting, we were negotiating a number with a lot of zeros in it. I will tell you what Marcia told me when the final offer came through. She set down the term sheet, folded her hands on her desk, and said, 12 years ago, I spent 2 hours on a contract review and charged you my standard rate. She paused. This is a very good return on your investment. The final number was $680 million for the IP acquisition, with an additional consulting agreement that brought the total value over the 30 months of the agreement close to what you might call the neighborhood of $780 million. Marcia made sure I understood every line. I signed everything. 4 days later, Medaxis filed a patent licensing challenge against Hartwell. I won't pretend I don't know what happened inside Hartwell's offices that week, because my old lead engineer, who I'd already quietly recruited into a consulting arrangement, along with 3 other members of my original team, kept me informed. The legal team was in emergency sessions. Derek Sloan, who had been preparing a big product announcement built around PathSync's next-generation capabilities, found himself in a conference room with outside counsel explaining that the foundational technology underpinning that announcement was no longer under Hartwell's control. The product announcement was postponed. Then it was canceled. Then the board called for an emergency review. My former lead engineer texted me, Derek just left the building with a box. Then, 20 minutes later, took less than one box actually. Didn't have much in his office. I sat with that one for a moment. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was more like the particular quiet that falls when a long tension finally releases. The consulting agreement with MedAccess meant I was, technically, working again almost immediately, but it wasn't the same as being someone's employee. I set my hours, I worked from my home office and from wherever I chose. I reported to Dr. Ingram, who valued what I knew and showed it in the way she ran meetings, listening first, talking second. My old team came along with me in stages. 4 people over 8 months. All of them better compensated than they'd been at Hartwell. All of them doing work that mattered. My wife came into my home office one morning about 3 weeks after the deal closed and found me sitting at my desk, not really doing anything, just looking out the window at the backyard. She put a cup of coffee next to my keyboard. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You good?" she asked. I thought about it for a real second before he answered. "I think I'm good," I said. I think I'd been good for longer than I realized, and I just couldn't see it from where I was standing. She nodded, like that made complete sense, because to her it probably did. 29 years. She's seen me in every configuration. She understood that what I'd lost, finally, wasn't a job. It was the weight of building something inside walls that were never quite mine. My daughter called when the news became public. The patent challenge, the acquisition, the MedAccess announcement. She's sharp, my daughter. She'd already connected the pieces before I said a word. "Dad," she said, "did you plan this?" "Not exactly," I told her, "but I was ready. There's a difference." She laughed. It was the same laugh she had at 7 years old, when she figured out a puzzle and couldn't contain it. "You've been holding that patent like a trump card for 12 years, and you didn't tell anyone." "I told your mother." A pause. "Of course you told Mom." What I want people to understand, and I say this not as someone who engineered a vindication, but as someone who got very lucky 12 years ago, that a smart attorney made me read a contract carefully, is that the most important moment in this story didn't happen in the Hartwell conference room, when they handed me that envelope. It didn't happen in the meeting with MedAccess. It didn't even happen when the wire transfer cleared. It happened at a conference in 2013, when a colleague I barely knew pulled me aside during a coffee break and said, quietly, like he was sharing something obvious that most people ignore, "You're building something. Make sure you know what part of it is yours." I didn't know his name. I'd never seen him before, and I never saw him after. But I went back to my hotel room that evening, and I called an attorney, and I started keeping records, and I did that quietly, consistently, for 12 years, not out of fear or suspicion, but out of a simple belief that the work you do with your own mind, on your own time, belongs to you. They fired me on a Tuesday. I said thank you and shook the hand of the man who delivered the news. I drove home to my wife and drank a glass of bourbon in the kitchen while the sun went down. I slept well that night, which surprised me. 23 days later, the deal with MedAccess closed. And here's what I know now, sitting on the other side of it. Derek Sloan didn't fire me because I was an obstacle. He fired me because he couldn't understand what I'd built, and what he can't understand, he can't control. And what he can't control makes him afraid. He wasn't incompetent, exactly. He was just dangerous in the specific way that people who have learned to perform expertise without possessing it are always dangerous. Not because of what they do, but because of what they displace. The technology Austin had dismissed as legacy systems. Forgive me. I spent 17 years building something, and sometimes I still think in his language. The technology Derek had dismissed as a legacy approach was, within 18 months of the MedAccess acquisition, the foundation of a surgical guidance platform operating in 91 hospitals, with a pipeline into the European market that their analysts project will generate over $1 billion in licensing over the next decade. The work was always good. It just needed to be somewhere it was understood. I'm not a bitter person. I've worked hard not to be. But I will say this, and I mean it plainly, not as a threat, or a lesson, or a quote for someone's LinkedIn post. If you are the person in your organization who actually builds things, who understands the architecture, who carries the institutional knowledge, Who shows up early and stays late not for recognition, but because the work matters to you? Keep records. Know what you own. Have a conversation with an attorney before something goes wrong, not after. And if they hand you an envelope on a Tuesday afternoon and the man delivering it can't meet your eyes, pick it up, say thank you, and walk out with your head level. The work you've done doesn't end when they close the door behind you. Sometimes that's the moment it finally begins. I've thought a lot about the moment my boss dropped that envelope on my desk and couldn't look me in the eye. Not with anger. That faded faster than I expected. But with something closer to clarity. Because what I understand now, sitting on the other side of it, is that the outcome of this story wasn't an accident. It was the result of choices I made quietly, consistently, over 17 years. Choices that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with who I decided to be when nobody was watching. The first choice was about integrity. When Marcia found that carve-out in my contract, 12 years before any of this happened, I could have let it go. Most people would have. I was young, I was grateful for the job, and protecting intellectual property felt like something that happened to other people. But something in me understood that doing right by your own work, documenting it honestly, claiming what was legitimately yours, wasn't arrogance. It was respect for the craft, for the years you put in. For the version of yourself that stayed up until 2 in the morning in a hotel parking lot because the problem mattered to you. I kept those records because it was the honest thing to do, not because I was planning an exit. The second choice was about staying sharp when it would have been easier to coast. After passing succeeded, I could have stopped learning. I'd built something that worked. But Derek Sloan's arrival taught me something I'm glad I already knew. That the moment you stop understanding what you've built, someone else will define it for you. I kept going deeper into the technical architecture, kept asking questions, kept treating every surgeon's feedback like a problem worth solving. That's why Dr. Ingram and I could sit across the table for 4 hours and speak the same language. That's why the deal is possible at all. Intelligence isn't a credential you earn once. It's a practice you maintain every single day. The third choice was about endurance, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I didn't fight when they handed me that envelope. I didn't argue or perform. I shook his hand and walked out, and that restraint wasn't weakness. It was 17 years of knowing that the work speaks, that patience is a form of power, and that the right moment to act is almost never the moment you're most angry. My wife understood this before I could articulate it. She poured me that glass of bourbon and said the work doesn't go away, and she was right, not because the universe owed me anything, but because I had never stopped earning it. Derek didn't fail because the universe punished him for being unkind. He failed because he made decisions without understanding what he was deciding about. That's a plain and simple consequence of leading something you've never taken the time to truly know. And I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because 12 years before I needed it, I made one careful choice with one careful attorney on one quiet evening, and then I kept showing up. My daughter asked me if I planned it. I told her there's a difference between planning and being ready. I think about that distinction a lot. You can't plan for when someone will underestimate you, but you can decide every single day that when that moment comes, you will have done the work. That's all the story is, really. Do the work, know it's yours, and when they hand you the envelope, say thank you and mean it.